A dark stage, a man in a black turtleneck, one device glowing in his hand. With a calm voice and a spark of arrogance, he rewired the future. Steve Jobs didn't just build products, he built a culture. He turned technology into religion, design into desire, and ambition into an art form. But behind the flawless launches and thunderous applause lived a paradox. A man obsessed with control, yet haunted by chaos. A visionary who preached simplicity, yet lived in conflict. Some called him a modern philosopher, others a tyrant with taste. This is the question we will face today. Was Steve Jobs a hidden Stoic, a man guided by discipline, courage, and focus? Or was he merely a genius who weaponized those virtues for his own ambition? Did he embody Stoicism or distort it? We will weigh his life against the four cardinal virtues that defined the Stoic tradition: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. We will follow his journey from the rebellious dreamer in a garage to the perfectionist shaping the world from a minimalist stage, and we will ask the question that outlives every invention: does success make a person good or merely great? Only then, after this trial of philosophy, can we decide whether Steve Jobs truly lived as a Stoic or just borrowed its armor to survive the battlefield of modern innovation. Now welcome to the Stoic Lighthouse, the channel where ancient wisdom illuminates the challenges of our modern age. Let the Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward peace and wisdom. If you believe that the lessons of the ancients still hold power today, join us by subscribing and helping this light reach others who seek meaning beyond achievement. Because this story is not about technology, it's about the battle between brilliance and virtue, the struggle between who we are and who we pretend to be. And as we follow the path of Steve Jobs, we'll confront a truth that every creator, leader, and dreamer must face. Mastery of the world means nothing if you cannot master yourself. Let's begin our journey where Jobs' power and his downfall both started. His ruthless, almost sacred obsession with focus. Number 1, the implacable focus, the Stoic art of saying no. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company was crumbling under the weight of confusion. Dozens of computers, peripherals, and projects drained its energy, and bankruptcy loomed. In one ruthless meeting, Jobs walked up to a whiteboard, drew a simple 4-square grid, and announced a radical new direction: consumer desktop, consumer laptop, professional desktop, professional laptop. Everything else was cut. In one stroke, he killed 70% of Apple's products and dismissed thousands of employees. Cold, brutal, but also decisive. That moment embodies the Stoic principle of eliminating the unnecessary to concentrate on what truly matters. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, believed that life should flow in harmony with a single rational principle. His biographer Diogenes Laertius tells us, Zeno believed that we must live consistently, which means our actions must be in harmony with one coherent, rational principle. For Jobs, that principle was creating insanely great products. His weapon was focus, sharpened by saying no far more than saying yes. This echoes Marcus Aurelius, who constantly reminded himself to examine every action with a single question. Marcus Aurelius asked, "Is this necessary?" Jobs lived by the same filter. He once explained that people misunderstand focus. It's not about choosing what to work on. It's about rejecting hundreds of other good ideas so that energy flows only into what is essential. According to Steve Jobs, people think focus means saying yes to the thing you've got to focus on, but that's not what it means at all. It means saying no to the 100 other good ideas that are out there. This philosophy extended beyond Apple's product line. It shaped the clean minimalism of design, the aesthetic of a single button, even the uniform he wore every day. Jobs understood what many Stoics taught, that clarity emerges not from addition, but subtraction. The clutter of options is the enemy of greatness. The same truth is found in modern voices like Greg McKeown, who defined essentialism as more than a productivity hack. Greg McKeown wrote, "Essentialism is not about how to get more things done. It's about how to get the right things done. It's not a time management strategy. It's a disciplined way of living." Jobs may not have read Zeno or McKeown, but his instinct echoed them. He cut, reduced, and concentrated with almost frightening intensity. And in doing so, he resurrected a dying company and built one of the most valuable empires on earth. Yet the Stoics would remind us that this discipline, powerful as it is only half the story. Without justice and virtue, the power of focus can become tyranny. Was Jobs a Stoic sage practicing harmony, or a strategist using Stoic tools for conquest? That is the tension we will carry forward. Number 2, the obstacle is the way, resilience in the face of humiliation. In 1985, Steve Jobs was humiliated in front of the entire business world. The prodigy who had built Apple in a garage, the visionary who had turned computers into tools for creativity, was ousted from his own company after a brutal power struggle. For most people, this would have been the end. For Jobs, it became the turning point. What seemed like a public execution became the foundation of his greatest comeback. This moment captures perfectly one of the most powerful Stoic truths. The obstacle is not the end of the path, it becomes the path itself. Marcus Aurelius explained this with words that could have been written about Jobs' exile. Our mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Stripped of his empire, Jobs did not vanish. He created Next, a company that never conquered the market but built the software architecture that would later power macOS. At the same time, he acquired a small graphics studio that the world would come to know as Pixar. The humiliation that should have buried him instead unlocked the most creative period of his life. In his Stanford commencement speech, Jobs reflected with a clarity that sounds deeply Stoic. According to Steve Jobs, "I didn't see it then, but getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." Epictetus, who himself was a slave before becoming one of the great Stoic teachers, would have recognized this transformation instantly. He taught that setbacks are never reasons for despair. They are training for the soul. According to Epictetus, difficulties show what men are. And Seneca, who knew exile and disgrace firsthand, offered a similar reminder. Difficulties strengthen the mind, just as labor strengthens the body. Modern voices echo this wisdom. Ryan Holiday, in his best-selling book The Obstacle is the Way, summarized this timeless idea for today's world. The obstacle in the path becomes the path. Never forget, within every obstacle is an opportunity to improve our condition. Jobs embodied this truth, whether consciously or not. He transformed his humiliation into a laboratory for reinvention. The exile that could have destroyed him became the crucible that refined his vision. This resilience, the ability to transform a wound into strength, is not just a corporate strategy. It is a Stoic practice lived in real time. Number 3, the Counsel of Death, practicing Memento Mori. When Steve Jobs faced pancreatic cancer in 2003, he did not just confront illness, he confronted the ultimate limit every human must one day face. Living nearly a decade with that reality etched into his body, Jobs came closer than most modern figures to embodying the ancient discipline of Memento Mori. For the Stoics, the thought of death was not an invitation to despair, but the most powerful tool for living with urgency, focus, and authenticity. Musonius Rufus, often called the Roman Socrates, insisted that reflecting on mortality was essential for building courage and stripping away trivial fears. According to Musonius Rufus, no man can live well if he has not learned to face death. This echoes directly in Jobs' Stanford speech. According to Steve Jobs, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Chrysippus, one of the great architects of Stoic logic, went further. He argued that fearing death is a judgment error, an irrational belief that something natural could be evil. For him, true wisdom was to correct the thought, not to escape the reality. This is why he insisted that philosophy must train the mind to meet death as part of the cosmic order. And centuries later, the French thinker Michel de Montaigne, deeply shaped by Stoicism, captured the same truth in his essays. To philosophize is to learn how to die. In Jobs' final decade, this philosophy seemed to radiate through his decisions. It was in the shadow of cancer that he oversaw the launch of the iPhone, the iPad, and the MacBook Air. Mortality pressed him, not into retreat, but into creation. Every product became a race against the clock. Every launch a reminder that time is the one currency we cannot replenish. Modern Stoic voices echo the same urgency. Donald Robertson, a leading interpreter today, explains that Memento Mori is not about morbid obsession, but about alignment. Keeping death in mind helps us cut through distractions and align life with our deepest values. In this sense, Jobs lived out one of the purest Stoic practices. He used death as a compass, but the question lingers. Did that compass guide him toward virtue or merely towards speed and brilliance without balance? Number 4, the failure of justice, where virtue collapsed. Discipline and brilliance made Steve Jobs a legend, but justice, the Stoic virtue of treating others with fairness and respect, was where his foundation cracked. Stories of his genius often walk hand in hand with stories of cruelty. Employees described meetings that ended in tears, humiliations that crushed spirits, and eruptions of rage that left scars far deeper than product deadlines. His refusal for years to acknowledge his daughter Lisa, even in the face of proof, remains a haunting mark on his personal legacy. For the Stoics, no amount of innovation or focus could excuse the collapse of justice. Musonius Rufus, who taught that philosophy must be lived in daily actions, made justice the very center of moral life. According to Musonius Rufus, it is not enough to know what is just. One must practice justice in dealings with all people. Jobs, however, often failed this test. He pursued excellence with relentless fire, but the flame sometimes burned those closest to him. Heracles, another Stoic voice, described humanity as a set of concentric circles, with the task of philosophy being to draw the outer circles. Neighbors, strangers, even enemies, closer, until all are treated as family. Jobs too often did the opposite, pushing even family and colleagues to the margins when they did not serve his vision. Even beyond the ancient world, this failing resonates. Adam Smith, the moral philosopher who inspired American ideals of commerce, wrote that justice is the bedrock without which no society can stand. And yet, in the halls of Apple, justice often bent beneath the weight of Jobs' temper. Modern Stoic thinkers have also warned against separating personal success from moral duty. Massimo Pigliucci reminds us that Stoicism is not merely about self-mastery, but about contributing to the common good. Virtue is social. It is about building a better world, not just a stronger self. Jobs did change the world through products, but in the measure of the Stoics, the question remains: did he change himself? Did he cultivate benevolence, fairness, and integrity in the circle of those who depended on him? Without justice, all other disciplines risk becoming weapons turned inward. Number 5, the obsession with externals, the wrong goal. Steve Jobs was a master of control. He micromanaged every pixel, every shade of aluminum, every word spoken on stage. Yet behind that discipline, his deepest aim seemed tied not to inner peace, but to outer triumph. The launches, the applause, the market victories, these became his scoreboard. For the Stoics, this was a dangerous trap, placing happiness on what lies beyond our control. Jobs' legacy forces us to ask, did he pursue virtue or did he chase validation from the crowd? Chrysippus, the great systematizer of Stoicism, taught that the true good rests only in virtue. All else, fame, wealth, status, are indifferents. They may be preferred, but they must never define our worth. According to Chrysippus, virtue alone is the goal of life. Everything else, wealth or reputation, is neither good nor bad. Jobs often seemed enslaved to those very externals. Biographers tell us how his mood rose and fell with the success of a product. When the iPhone shattered expectations, he was ecstatic. When a launch faltered, he sank into fury. His peace depended not on his choices, but on the judgment of the market. Epictetus would have called this a fundamental error in judgment, the choice to ground happiness in what no man controls. Even modern voices warn of this trap. William B. Irvine explains that Stoics practice goal internalization, turning external aims into internal commitments. For instance, rather than aiming to win a tennis match, which depends on chance and opponent, the Stoic aims to play to the best of their ability, which depends only on themselves. William B. Irvine reminds us, attach your goals to what you control, not to what others may decide. Jobs, by contrast, aim to build the best product in the world, a goal forever vulnerable to critics, rivals, and shifting markets. His happiness was fragile because it rested outside his command. We can also look beyond the ancient Stoics to other voices. Heraclitus, a pre-Stoic philosopher, observed that seeking external validation blinds us to inner balance. Character is destiny. In America today, the culture of hustle, likes, and external approval reflects this same tension. We celebrate those who achieve, but too often we ignore whether they are at peace. Jobs' story becomes a mirror for that imbalance, a man who conquered technology but never fully mastered himself. Musonius Rufus emphasized that wealth and status are meaningless if the soul is corrupted. He believed true success was measured in virtue, not possessions. And modern Stoics like Donald Robertson insist that shifting our gaze inward is the only path to resilience in a chaotic world. So here lies the paradox. Jobs mastered the discipline of focus and resilience, but he directed them toward externals. His genius gave us devices that shape our lives, yet the Stoic would ask, at what cost to his soul? To pursue excellence without anchoring it in virtue is like building the perfect vessel, only to steer it toward the wrong harbor. Number 6, the slavery of anger, the absence of temperance. Steve Jobs was celebrated for his vision, but feared for his temper. Accounts from Apple's corridors describe him exploding at employees, dismantling ideas with brutal words, and leaving even brilliant engineers shaken. To outsiders, this was passion. To the Stoics, it was slavery, the loss of control to the most corrosive of emotions. Cleanthes, the successor of Zeno, warned that emotions untamed become chains that bind the soul. According to Cleanthes, the violent man is least free, for he is mastered by his own impulses. Jobs' outbursts fit this picture. His fury was not an external force, but a self-inflicted captivity. The Stoics saw anger as a false judgment, the belief that the world has wronged us and must bend to our desires. Once we grant that thought legitimacy, reason collapses. Beyond the Stoics, Heraclitus, the philosopher of constant change, warned that harmony requires balance, not excess. Character is destiny, and self-control is the measure of greatness. Modern interpreters of Stoicism echo this timeless insight. Massimo Pigliucci points out that temperance is not weakness, but the anchor that prevents us from being carried away by destructive currents. He writes that leaders who cannot master themselves cannot claim to guide others. In Apple's story, we see how Jobs' temper extracted excellence at times, but also corroded trust and human dignity. Even thinkers outside philosophy have touched the same truth. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, survivor of the camps, once explained that between stimulus and response lies our power to choose. Jobs often surrendered that space, reacting with rage instead of reason. This is the heart of the Stoic charge against him. Focus without temperance becomes tyranny. Resilience without calm becomes stubbornness. Genius without balance becomes self-destruction. Apple may have flourished, but in Stoic terms, Jobs failed to govern the most important empire, himself. Number 7, the final verdict, a master of the tools, not the philosophy. The case has been presented. On one side, the evidence shows Steve Jobs as a man of extraordinary discipline, resilience, and clarity in the face of death. He embodied principles that sound undeniably Stoic, saying no to distractions, turning setbacks into fuel, remembering mortality to sharpen purpose. These are not small things. They are practices that built not just a company, but a culture that reshaped the modern world. And yet, on the other side of the ledger, we find his failures. Injustice toward those closest to him, obsession with outcomes beyond his control, and the enslavement to anger that shattered the virtue of temperance. To the Stoics, philosophy was never about tools alone. It was about the whole life lived. Musonius Rufus reminded his students that philosophy is not theory, but practice. Cleanthes compared a philosopher without virtue to a musician who knows notes but cannot play a song. The contrast fits Jobs perfectly. He mastered the hardware of discipline, but failed to install the software of justice, moderation, and inner peace. Zeno, who founded Stoicism after losing his fortune in a shipwreck, discovered in disaster that the true wealth of a man lies in character. He would have looked at Jobs' legacy and asked, did this man cultivate virtue, or did he merely cultivate success? According to Zeno, the goal is not to live, but to live well. Jobs certainly lived loudly, brilliantly, and impactfully. But did he live well in the Stoic sense? That depends on what measure you use. If the measure is innovation, then yes, he lived a life of genius. If the measure is control over externals, then yes, he bent industries to his will. But if the measure is virtue, the Stoics would be less generous. The discipline he used to strip products of excess was not used to strip his soul of excess anger. The clarity with which he faced death did not translate into the clarity to treat his daughter with justice. His resilience in exile from Apple did not always make him more compassionate to those who shared his burdens. Modern interpreters echo this caution. Donald Robertson explains that Stoicism without ethics is like medicine without healing. It can cut and dissect, but it does not cure. Massimo Pigliucci warns that many admire Stoic life hacks for productivity, but miss the heart of the philosophy, which is virtue. And William B. Irvine emphasizes that Stoicism is not about achieving greatness in the eyes of the world, but about reducing needless suffering by mastering desire and fear. The truth about Steve Jobs may be this. He was a master of Stoic techniques, not of Stoic philosophy. He wielded its tools, focus, resilience, memento mori, as weapons to build an empire. But he did not live by its compass, which points always toward justice, moderation, and the pursuit of virtue above all. Like Heraclitus warned, the way up and the way down are one and the same. Jobs climbed to the highest peaks of human achievement, but his path downward was carved by the same forces, ambition, obsession, anger, that powered his ascent. This verdict matters because it is not really about Steve Jobs. It is about us. We live in a culture that celebrates discipline, hustle, productivity, and disruption. We admire those who can bend reality. But the Stoics remind us to ask, to what end? If we use these tools to win the world but lose our soul, have we truly succeeded? Jobs leaves us with a double lesson. On one side, he proves the incredible power of Stoic practices when applied to work. He shows us what clarity of focus, resilience after failure, and awareness of death can accomplish in the external world. On the other, he warns us of the void that remains when those practices are not rooted in justice, temperance, and virtue. The brilliance becomes tyranny, the genius becomes cruelty, and the empire built on glass remains fragile. The final verdict, then, is complex. Steve Jobs was not a Stoic sage, but he was perhaps the most vivid modern example of how Stoic tools can transform the world while leaving the self untransformed. He is a case study, both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because discipline and resilience can make us powerful beyond imagination. Warning because without virtue, that power can burn others and consume ourselves. So we leave the courtroom of philosophy with this judgment. Steve Jobs was a master of the tools, but a dropout of the philosophy. And for us, that is not a reason to dismiss him. It is a reason to study him, to take what he mastered and complete what he left undone. Steve Jobs' life is more than a story about technology. It is a philosophical case study, a mirror for anyone chasing greatness. He showed us how discipline, resilience, and focus can change the world. But he also showed us how neglecting justice, temperance, and virtue can leave a legacy marked by contradictions. The Stoics would tell us that true success is not measured in applause, stock prices, or innovation, but in the calm strength of a mind governed by virtue. Jobs won the world, but the jury is still out on whether he ever won himself. This is the challenge for us. Will we use the tools of Stoicism to conquer the externals, money, status, recognition, or will we use them to master the only empire that truly matters, the one within? According to Zeno, the goal is to live in agreement with nature, in harmony with reason and virtue. Your life, like Jobs's, will be judged not only by what you built, but by who you became in the process, and that verdict is still in your hands. So tell us, after hearing the defense and the accusation, what is your verdict on Steve Jobs? Did he live as a Stoic, or did he only borrow its armor to win his battles? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and your reflections sharpen our own. If this journey gave you a new perspective, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who admires Jobs. Let them see not only the brilliance, but also the warning hidden in his story. Together, we can grow this community of seekers who choose wisdom over noise, virtue over vanity. And don't miss our next video. We will dive into the story of another figure who stood face to face with power, challenged tyranny with integrity, and proved that true courage lies not in shouting, but in standing firm when fear closes in. You won't want to miss it. Remember this final lesson. It is not enough to build a legacy. You must also build a soul. See you in the next video.